Then let's begin. Welcome everybody to this Emerging Voices Network Masterclass. It's great to see you all. This particular masterclass is being held in collaboration with the Stanley Centre and is serving as a partial introduction to our Adventures in Nuclear Risk Reduction projects that we're doing with them. But it's also open to participants of that project and also to members of the Emerging Voices Network, so you're all very welcome. Our masterclass today is Dr. Mikhail Derko, who is a full professor of international relations in the Department of Public Administration and Sociology at Erasmus University Rotterdam. His research covers the areas of informal state cooperation in institutionalized settings in international politics, and also domestic sources of foreign and security policy in Europe. He has been a junior faculty fellow at Stanford University. He obtained his PhD in political science from Vrije University, Amsterdam in 2014. He was a Max Weber Fellow at the European University Institute and a Fulbright visiting researcher at Columbia University's Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies. He's also done a lot of work on oral history in the nuclear field, and he'll be speaking about that today. And I'm really looking forward to his talk. Over to you, Mikhail.
Hi, everyone. Very welcome to my presentation. Thanks very much for inviting me and for having me to talk today. I prepared a little slideshow and a presentation today, which I will get on with in a second. But I want to encourage you to ask any questions you might have during the presentations, and I have also reserved some time at the end to answer any remaining issues. So if you have any question, just use the raise hand function, and I will call on you. I will not be monitoring the chat during the presentation, but I assume that if there is any burning question, Dave will probably jump in and will alert me. So it's a great pleasure to talk about oral history because I'm a great fan of oral history as a method. I am a serial offender when it comes to conducting oral history projects, and I am very interested in use of oral history for research. And so it's great that that I can be here today, and it's also my pleasure to tell you something about this. If all is good, you should be now seeing my slides. Is that good? Okay. I want to, I prepared a slideshow that sort of combines three elements, and I will talk a little bit about the methodology. I will talk about what are the potential considerations or use cases. I will give you an example from my own work on the MPT extension, and I will talk about how it is possible to sort of publish the work from oral history. And then at the end, I will talk a little bit about some practical considerations. The elements that I think you will take away from today are really the things about the methodology, and I will try to get into these nitty-gritty details, and also about getting your oral history published, or getting published, which involves oral history out in academic journals. I would like to start with a very general introduction. You may ask, why should we even use oral history? And my sense is that there are primarily three reasons to use oral history. And the first one is, we often don't know what happened in a certain situation. We know the principle of oral history. We know it from our own family lives. So if you ever asked your grandma, how did you meet the grandfather, or if you ever asked your parents about something that happened before you were born, you sort of understand the principle of oral history. And in that way, we can learn about what happened. You could also learn it from a book. You could also learn it from a newspaper. And in some countries, there is, for instance, a habit. If you want to know, for instance, how your grandparents got to know each other, in some countries, there is a habit of putting wedding announcements in newspapers. So you can go and look up the wedding announcement, but you can also ask grandma. You're going to probably get a slightly different story in both cases. One is going to be a little more personal, whereas the other one will be a little more factual. But even sometimes, even if we know what happened, we might not know fully why it happened or how it happened. And this is where oral history really helps, because it allows us to sort of provide firsthand experience from directly involved individuals who can tell you something about very important moments in history. And this is essentially at the core of oral history as a method. It allows us to use the memories and voices of individuals to understand the complexity of past events. We often get oral history because it allows us to understand multiplicity of perspectives on what happened in the past. And we wouldn't be able to get that if we didn't speak to people who are in other areas, or who are whose voices might not have, for instance, been recorded in official documents. So you might get to see and hear perspectives of people who might not be in the mainstream. Now, you can think about the uses of oral history in three extremely broad categories. The first category are very traditional oral history projects. Political scientists, international relations scholars, but also historians have in the past used oral history in a very traditional way through interviewing people one-on-one. You essentially conduct one-on-one interviews with someone else, and you try to interview that person, and you try to understand where do they stand, where do they come from. You ask the questions that you are very interested in. In the field of international relations, there is a really famous Commonwealth oral history project organized by Professor Sue Onslow from London's Institute for Commonwealth Studies. Some of you might be familiar with the work of Carlo Patti on the history of Brazil's nuclear program. And there are also numerous different projects that you can find in the literature that are related to Israel's national security strategy, or to things like creation of the Mercosur market. And that is really interesting approach if you have a lot of people who were in very different positions, not necessarily maybe even at the same time, and you are interested in their individual perceptions. So how they individually perceived something, how they individually experienced a certain moment. You're going to get a multitude of perspectives, but that might be actually the goal of your project. You might want to actually get these multitude of perspectives, because people might be sitting in different places in institutions, people might be in different roles, and they might even be in different positions. Certain historical processes might impact on them differently. And so that might actually encourage these various projects. The second type of oral history in the study of international politics are oral history conferences. And you may also find in the field of history of economics or history of ideas, this is also sometimes called as witness seminars. And the idea behind the witness seminar is that you bring together a group of people who worked at the same time on the same issue, or they took part in the same event. There is, for instance, a famous book published by Maas and Smorenchik on the history of behavioral economics, where they basically brought together 25 or 30 founding fathers and mothers of behavioral economics. And so those were the people who were sort of at the beginning of the behavioral economics as a field. And so they might not have, some of them worked together, of course, in the past, but they sort of all were active around the same period of time. And the key in this moment is essentially to feed interaction. So whereas in the first type of project, the goal is to essentially get each individual perspective, each individual testimony in a way. Here, the goal is essentially to have to spur the interaction between participants, where you hope to learn something from the fact that they are actually going to react to one another. Because they may disagree with one another, they may want to add details, they may want to bring nuance, they may want to bring a different point of view. And that is the thing that really helps. You may find, for instance, interesting the work of Blight, Welch, and Allen on Cuban Missile Crisis there, but also, for instance, the work of William Walworth on the end of Cold War. And so in this project, it might be interesting to, when you have, for instance, decision-making within one actor, and then you try to understand why did that actor do or didn't do something, and how that actor's actions were interpreted by someone else. And the third type are the so-called critical oral history, is the so-called critical oral history or critical oral history conferences. And the key difference between the first two types and the third type is the fact that in critical oral history, you let people work with documents. You essentially let them work with primary sources. And so you very often, you bring the sources to the table, sometimes quite literally, and you say, well, but in 1990, in your assessment, you wrote this. So how did that happen? How did you end up in this document? And what was the process that went into it? And that helps you to sort of center the discussion on a particular document. That has its advantages because you're centered really on one document. So you can essentially get feedback of people into a single document, and you can learn much more about it. It has also its disadvantages. And the disadvantages are that you are centered on the work of one document. Again, I can highlight here the work of Onslow and Van Wyk on the liberation in Southern Africa. There is a really interesting project by Malea, Spector, and Wheeler on the nuclear cooperation between Brazil and Argentina. And there is a work that I have done together with Leopoldo Nuti on the NPT extension, and with whom we organized this critical oral history conference. One of the things that you may, before we go further, it might be a good moment to remember that there is no right or wrong way. Each of these is a valid manner of conducting oral history, but you do need to remember that each of them plays a very different role in your research project, and so you're going to get slightly different outcome from it. I'm going to talk a little bit about the mechanics of oral history, but before I go on, I want to give a shout out to a fantastic book published by Patricia Levy, which is called Oral History. It was published by Oxford University Press, if I remember correctly, in 2011. And it's a really wonderful step-by-step resource that helps anyone to understand how oral histories are, how to think about oral history as a conceptual issue, but also very practical hands-on advice on how to do oral history project. In an oral history project, your focus is on interviews and statements. So the focus is what your interviewee tells you. And you focus here on personal experiences, on memories of events, attitudes, values, beliefs, opinions. This is what it is the most useful for, because people will tell you how they think about something or how they used to think about something. What were their considerations? How did they approach a certain issue? How did they think about it? There is a lot of criticism, of course, of oral history, because anyone who has ever done research on interviews will hear, or using interviews, will hear immediately the response, which is, well, people tell you what they want you to know, or what people want you to get away from it. in a way that interviews are, in a way, a biased source of information. And I never found that particularly persuasive, because anyone who has ever worked with historical data knows that archives are also biased. In the archives, we're going to find only a selection of documents. And very often, if you go to an archive, you don't quite understand, or you don't quite know who made that selection, for what purpose, with what goal, at what moment, what are the things that were left out, what are the things that were kept for posterity. You also know that only certain perspectives get represented in official archives. So if you want to understand, for instance, a certain foreign policy decision, then of course certain perspectives are going to be present, but not others' perspectives, because sometimes some people have no access to sort of have their ideas archived. But also certain perspectives, people have an incentive not to archive them. And last but not least, there might be a criticism that people will lie to you in an interview, but I don't think it's going to be a total shocker for anyone to hear that similarly in an interview-based work, in archival documents, people may lie in documents that they write, or they may be completely forthcoming with the truth. So in a way, I would say interviews are oral histories interviews are a really good way to get individual perspectives and memories and recollections. This is really a co-creation process. It's a process where you work together with the respondent on how the interview is going to look like in the end. And so it asks for a self-reflection. So what kind of questions am I going to ask? Why am I asking these questions? Why does it interest me? What do I want to know? What do I want to learn? But it also allows you to give space to your respondent, to sort of allow this respondent to co-craft the interview, as if you will. And I'll come back to that in a second. Just to give you a little bit of an illustration, I would like to highlight the project that I did together with Paul Danuti on the history of the MPT's indefinite extension. We started working on this project in summer 2016. And one of the reasons for working on this project was the fact that there was not much that was at that time known about the MPT's extension. And a lot of these documents that were related, that were already, that existed in the archives were still under lock, because MPT extension was at that time less than 25 years away. And so a lot of these documents were still classified. And so we decided that oral history project was appropriate here, because it would allow us to understand what happened, but also why and how it happened. So at the start of the project, I created an interview frame, which was based on an extensive literature search. So basically, I took a look at the literature and I tried to understand what we know about the extension of the MPT, but also what we don't know. So what are still the open questions? And then I took a look at the international relations scholarship, and I tried to figure out what could be the factors that we should be interested in, what could be the things that we should care about in this context. And so in the interviews themselves, and the interview framework, it focused on both the motivations, but also on the facts. So what happened, but also why and how it happened. And that sort of allowed to really capitalize on a lot of these opportunities which were created by the oral history as a method. In this project, I started by identifying the potential interviewees, and I started by having a list which was composed on this existing literature. But also I took a look at, for instance, the list from the official list of attendees from the UN records. And very soon, I also got additional suggestions based on snowballing. So you interview someone, and they recommend you to interview someone else. And in that sense, snowballing can very quickly lead to a really overwhelming list of interviewees. And so what I did then was to essentially focus on people who are in the more prominent functions in their delegations. So people who are either leading the delegations or were really hands-on working on the extension. Because the goal was from the beginning to organize also this critical oral history conference, next to the interviews, I also started collecting primary documents and primary materials for the conference, which then fed to sort of starting and whipping up the debate at the oral history conference. I initially approached the interviewees, all of them by email, and I sort of tried to set up the interview in a way which would make these people feel safe, but also gave them a feeling of autonomy and freedom. Patricia Levy, in her work, talks about the fact that people are most open if they are feeling safe, if they think that they're being respected. And so you need to understand who your interviewees are. For instance, we knew that most of the respondents would be diplomats. Diplomats like to keep face, but they also like to get a lot of control around their environment. So we met them at the place that they preferred. We met them at the moment they preferred. They could sort of decide to have a part of it off the record, because that allowed me to create a rapport with the person. This person was not afraid that their thoughts are going to get in the public, but also at the same time, it created a possibility for them to actually feel safe, that they knew that if there are things they want to share, but they don't want to be print, they knew that that was possible. One thing to keep in mind here is that it happens very often that your respondent is going to wander off, that your respondent is going to talk, is going to go off on a tangent. And this is not only okay, this is totally appropriate in the method, because the goal of the method is essentially not only to give the spotlight to the respondent, but also to essentially make them feel the most comfortable possible with the whole method. And that means that if they think that at some point it's appropriate for them to go off on a tangent, then you let them go off on a tangent for 15, 20, 30 minutes. The final consideration that you should think about, talking about oral history projects, are legal considerations. So if you are based currently in Europe, GDPR is a really important thing. So you have to think about the legal considerations and the privacy considerations. I assume most of you are social scientists, so you should think about how to further use your data. So your data should be fair, so it should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. I would recommend you to, at the very beginning, already start thinking about the data sharing. So how are you going to share your data for the future generations? One of the best things that you can do with your oral history is to basically create a repository of the transcripts, or submit your transcripts somewhere to the repository so it can be used by future generations of scholars. And so how are you going to share the transcript? Where are you going to share it? Where it's going to be online? How it is going to be findable? Those are all questions that you should think about. In my oral history project, because we work together with the Wilson Center on this, we knew from the beginning that our transcript is going to end up in the digital archive of the Wilson Center, and that made our life easier. But you should think about, where is your data going to end up? Where are you going to share it? And how are you going to make sure that if somebody, if you are writing a history of, I don't know, Swiss nuclear weapon program, and somebody in 20 years is going to write the history of Swiss nuclear weapon program, how do you make sure that they're going to find your interview transcripts? I don't want to scare anyone off, but doing good oral history is extremely expensive. It takes a lot of money. It's not only about the money for traveling, but it's also about to go and meet your respondents, but it's also money that you need for if you are going to organize a critical oral history or oral history conference. You need money to put people up. You need money to travel, to let people travel, to pay for their hotels, for food, and so on and so forth. From the very beginning, you should think about how are you going to transcribe these oral histories. So very often you need to think about whether you're going to, nowadays there is a software that can help you with that. Some of it is even GDPR compliant. It's not free, but it's okay. But even the transcripts of the software still require checking and verification by a human who is going to sort of have a look at it and also check the transcript. That all takes time. If you are going to, for instance, hire a student assistant to help you with that, that again will cost money. And last but not least, if you're going to do an oral history conference, you have to think about how are you going to record it, which method are you going to use. There is enormous number of methods for recording conferences, and they really vary in how expensive or cheap they are. I still want to move on to talk about how to get things published. And there are three primary ways to get things published. And the first one is essentially publication of raw transcripts. There are some projects where people basically come and they manage to publish the transcripts in raw, as a raw version of the transcripts. That's possible, but it's very unlikely. I would say unless you have a really, really specific niche, it's very unlikely. It might happen if there is an institute which is interested in publishing something on their website, or if there is a think tank which is interested in publishing a collection on something. But academic publishers are unlikely to publish something like this. The second option are academic papers which are primary interview-based. In other words, you combine interviews from insights from multiple interviews that you may have coded or you might have processed in some other way, and you essentially publish it as a standalone paper or a book, which primarily works with these interviews. This is easier, but it's not different from, in this way, the oral history interviews are not much different from the other work, which is primarily interview-based. And it creates challenges when it comes to replicability. So you basically need to make sure that your data is in some way replicable, which might call on people, for instance, to share your, it might call on you to share your data, for instance. But it is possible, and it's something that researchers have done repeatedly in the past. And oral history here is not necessarily specific. What I think is unique for for the use of oral history is to use oral history interviews as a source for triangulation with other data. And so this is on one hand the easiest to get published, but it also is really the most interesting because it allows you to combine oral history with primary documents and secondary documents. So it allows you to combine existing literature with primary documents like archival sources and oral history. And here again, this is the best way to use oral history as a way to fill the gaps between what, how, and why. In other words, sometimes the documents that are based on secondary and primary documents might have the what gaps, sometimes they might have the how gaps, and sometimes they might have the why gaps. And so this is where the oral history can really help you shine, because with the focus on individual perspectives, values, norms, perceptions, this is where oral history can really help you in writing your work. This does, however, require quite a clear delineation of your research question, as well as some preparation of your work in advance. It does require quite a bit of pre-work before you actually start working and collecting your oral history data. From the practice of trying to publish some of the work based on oral history, my two pieces of advice here to you are that the larger your group of interviewees, the easier it is to make the argument and justify the publication. In terms of the pure methodology of science and also conceptual basis, the number of interviewees shouldn't really matter too much. However, reviewers do like to see ceteris paribus a higher number of interviewees than the lower number of interviewees, so this is something to keep in mind. The second one is that it really helps if you cover the most important respondents in your group. So essentially, the people that, if somebody thinks about a certain topic, who are the names that come most to mind to people at the beginning? Again, this is not really rooted in the theory of science. It's not really, there is no epistemology behind it, but it is something that reviewers like to see. In other words, if your reviewer is an expert in a given field, they probably expect that people they know in the field will be interviewed for your project. And so that might help to sort of make it easier to publish. I think I will stop now, but before I stop, I want to just give a quick shout to this book, the Routledge Handbook of Foreign Policy Analysis Methods, where I have a chapter on oral history, from which I have drawn in preparing my slides today. You can buy it online, and I look forward to any questions that you might have for me. Thank you.
So much, Mikhail. That was brilliant and really exciting. Certainly whet my appetite for our project. We have one question, or well, several questions from one questioner in the chat. I'll pose them all to you, Mikhail, and then you can respond. Please, everyone else, do feel free to put questions in the chat or raise your hand if you would like to pose a question verbally. This masterclass is being recorded. You're very welcome to turn your camera on and pose your question verbally if you wish to, or if you prefer not to be on camera, you can just keep the camera off and still speak. But raise your hand if you want to do that. Otherwise, pop your questions in the chat. So over to Javed's questions. What is the ultimate purpose for oral history as a method? Is it to pave the way for theoretical construction, or is it simply about knowledge preservation and being inductive in nature throughout? And then question 2, given the use of oral history in the study of politics, in your understanding, which of the IR paradigms does oral history essentially belong to? Is it positivist or post-positivist? Questions?
Thank you. So I would say to both questions, the answer is it depends. The answer to the first question, which was sorry, the answer to the second question, whether it's positivist or post-positivist. People have used it in both ways. People have used it in a positivist way to sort of as evidence in, for instance, process tracing. But people have used it also in post-positivist, constructivist work, trying to understand the motivations, norms, and values. And either of them is acceptable. So I would say this is not a method which would sort of squarely fall in one of the theories. Those who know my academic work, I'm broadly a positivist scholar. I'm not firmly committed to any particular school of positivism, but I would describe myself as a broadly positivist scholar. I have found numerous uses of oral history in my work. However, there is a lot of work that exists that have been done by others, which uses oral history in purely post-positivist way. So So it's a very it's a very clear it's a method that allows you to use different approaches. When it comes to the first question about the purpose of oral history and whether it's about theoretical construction or about knowledge preservation, again, the original way how oral history was conceived back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s was primarily about knowledge preservation, and it was about preservation of underrepresented voices. So sort of what you would call the knowledge from below, so the everyday life of people. However, the expansion of the method especially in foreign policy analysis, you now sort of go into the area where people collect interviews from respondents from all sorts of life. And again, knowledge preservation is very important. However, I'm not sure if I would necessarily agree that it's only for being inductive. You can also use it for deductive research. You can also use it for hypothesis testing. Again, this is something that people have done in the past. I have done it in the past. If you use, to the degree to which any process tracing could be used for hypothesis testing, and I know that there are purists in the methodology of science who would say, no, you cannot use process tracing or interviewing for testing hypotheses. To the degree that you agree that this is possible, oral history is a suitable model for that.
Fantastic. Thanks very much for that. Next up, we have Christelle, who has her hand up. Please go ahead with the question, Christelle.
Thank you so much, Dave, and thank you so much, Dr. Onderko, for this excellent presentation and introduction to oral history research and methods. So I found the whole presentation very fascinating, particularly the part in which you shared your experience with conducting oral history in relation to the NPT with the Wilson Center. And I guess out of curiosity, have you engaged, or are you maybe, in the process of engaging or considering engaging with incorporating oral history into analyzing other nuclear disarmament or non-proliferation treaties, like, for example, the CTBT and the Annex 2 structure, for instance, or maybe the TPNW, or like gridlocks at the Conference on Disarmament? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I didn't mention this, but during the pandemic, I was involved in another project with the Wilson Center, where we did a critical oral history oral history of the NGO efforts in the nuclear field. So we did a project where we looked at activities of civil society. And we looked at the role of activists, funders, and other, civil society in this field. Also, knowledge production. One thing that is really useful and interesting to know here is that there is a lot of scope for new work, but there is also one of the things to keep in mind is that there is so much happening. And critical oral history is really suitable for understanding something that has happened in the past. Thank you very much, Ben, for putting the link there. The work that we did on civil society and nuclear risk reduction, I really enjoyed doing it, but we also at some point realized that there is too many people who are still active in the field, and that prevents them from being completely transparent and completely frank about things. And so one of the things that I learned there is that I wouldn't go and enter into new discussion onto something that is maybe still ongoing. So if I were to look at, for instance, TPNW, I would wait for another 5-10 years before I would go and do a serious oral history project. But again, that's just my feeling, and I don't want to prevent anyone from doing groundbreaking work. So in that sense, I think it helps if there is some time distance between the current moment and the interview and what you're trying to study. I do want to add a little nuance there that there are people who have done successful projects which were focused on very current events. So Matthias Spector did, for instance, a project on the Tehran Declaration of 2010, where Brazil, Iran, and Turkey tried to sort of provide an alternative solution to the debates around Iran's nuclear program. And he ran that project, I think, less than 10 years after the Tehran Declaration itself. It was a highly successful project, so you can do it, but again, I wouldn't go into a project on something that is really happening right now.
Thank you so much. The next question, I believe, was from Ariel. Okay, please go ahead, Ariel.
Hi, can you hear me? Hello.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Hi, I am so sorry. I cannot turn on my camera right now. The internet is not really having it with me today. I have two questions. The first question is that what makes the OH project or conduct different than just normal interview? So okay, tie-in advertisement. I run a nuclear reading club, and we have a nuclear scholar come to our sessions, and I do an interview with them, and some people are in the room where things happens, and we talked about that too. And I was reflecting on that, and I think I wasn't really I can't be conducting some oral history, so what would be the differences? Like, are we walking to the room with some hypothesis, or it has to be properly that we are conducting oral history project? And the second question is, there must be a way to ask a bad question. So I'm kind of like, I'm kind of asking this in a sense that if I were to conduct the oral history research, then I wanted to avoid that, like leading questions or some questions with bias, or perhaps like what would make me great at my job if I wanted to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. So the first question is actually it's actually quite easy, because what makes, I think, oral history is different than interviewing is that there is, first of all, there is even less structure than in interviewing. In interviewing, you very often have hypotheses that you want to test. You very often have a certain pre-existing issues that you want to sort of get to the bottom of. The more you, I don't think that it's a matter of category. I think it's rather a sort of a sliding scale. But the less you get rid of your preconceived notions, the more you slide towards the oral history interview. So if you have someone in the room who has, if you're doing, for instance, a book club with someone who was in the room and who has later published a book about it, and you sort of refer to you round the conversation where you consistently refer to the book, that would come, in my view, very close to critical oral history, because you essentially lead you have a personal discussion about memories and recollections that is centered around a document, which is a book. Your second question about whether you can ask a bad question. So I think there are bad questions, so of course, me coming from a little more positivist tradition, I always try to ask questions which are not leading, which are not sort of putting my respondent on a certain path. And so I try to sort of be as open-minded as possible there. The second question, which is a bad question, is in the oral history context, is one that can be answered with a single word. You do want to ask questions that invite the respondent to sort of think broadly, that invite the respondent to provide you with a long answer, that allow a respondent to open up. If your question can be answered in a single word, then I would recommend to reword that question. And the third issue is because it is important to build a rapport between you and the respondent, you do want to sort of avoid questions that are going to annoy your respondent. And this might be sometimes very difficult to do, but let's say you may have already a preconceived notion about certain policy that it might have been harmful, for instance. But I wouldn't go to an interviewee and say, why did you pursue this stupid policy? I would essentially more try to understand what their pursuit of a certain policy was. More generally, you do want to understand how certain things come into play, how they happen. It's not necessarily about what, which is very often what people want to learn in normal interviews, and it's more about how and why.
That's great. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for these brilliant questions. We really appreciate all of you being here, no matter what the technical difficulties are you're having to contest with. The next question comes from Bartu. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to ask my question, and also very much for the presentation. My name is Bartu. I'm a master's student at ETH, and a bit unconventionally, I'm coming from a technical background rather than the social science background. So getting this lecture about oral history was very interesting. My question is, again, regarding more of a personal one. I got selected for the Hiroshima ICANN Academy, and next month we're going to be actually going to Hiroshima to speak with the hibakusha, with the people that were affected from the nuclear weapon. And you talked about how to navigate oral history interviews when it comes to diplomats, and I do have a bit of experience from the diplomatic side or with the defense officials or the military. But in terms of for the humanitarian side, I was just curious if you would have any advice as to how to navigate the question and the topics of discussion carefully, and how to also maximize the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question, and congratulations on your selection. Talking to hibakusha is always extremely moving and extremely emotional, because these people went through really painful experience that have often marked also the remainder of their life. I had multiple times the privilege of talking to hibakusha, and they are extremely, I always came away sort of with new ideas, but also recollections about how painful their experience was. My recommendation on how to sort of approach these moments is to approach it like if you were to talk to anyone who really survived a very traumatizing, violent event. And that might be also similar to survivors of war, for instance. You want to be very sensitive, but you also may want to sort of know something about their experience in advance. And you may want to really focus on their experiences, on their perceptions, the environment around them. I remember meeting a hibakusha in summer 2023 with a different group of scholars who visited Hiroshima. And one of the things that I really learned and took away was about the stigma that was associated with being a survivor of nuclear attack. And for instance, the fact that for many of the girls and women who survived the nuclear attack, it was very difficult afterwards to find spouses. And that was something that I wasn't aware of before. And so that is something that you learn only after a few probing questions, but also in an environment where people on both sides feel safe, but also feel respected. And so that would be my recommendation for approaching an interview with hibakusha, to sort of learn something about it in advance, and come there with curiosity and with questions that focus on them, because they are the most important person there. And I mean, if you meet someone who has so many years of experience, it's important to sort of understand how these really important traumatizing events also impacted their life afterwards. So, yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
much. The next question is from Seb. So go ahead, Seb.
Thanks, Dave, and thank you, Mikhail. It's been a great presentation, very clear. Two questions, if we have time. The first is about you mentioned at the beginning the issue of classification and oral history as a way of potentially being able to get around classification issues, but for me that sort of throws up other questions about what are the consequences of that, both for the speaker and for the listener, or the person conducting the oral history project. What are the considerations that they need to think about, both from the point of view of protecting the person who's speaking, but also themselves, and particularly if the data set is to become available publicly? Where does responsibility lie in that, I suppose? And then the second question is, how do we navigate somebody that we think is an unreliable, or could be an unreliable, storyteller? If you were in a court of law, you'd get around that by cross-examining them, and you'd kind of get them to dance to your tune and try and get them off balance, so that they slip up and they tell you what you really need to know. In the Levy model, you're trying to do the opposite. You're getting them to be as comfortable as possible. And with that, you would provide them with a long runway to basically try and work out the story as they'd like to tell it, rather than catch them off balance to tell the story perhaps as it really was. So what do we do there? Is there any way to deal with that, or do we just have to accept that's part of the game?
Two fantastic questions. So let's talk about the classification first. So if you really want to talk about things that are the way how when I said that we talked about things that are not yet declassified, many of these things were not formally secret, but they were not for public consumption, right? So people are not running the legal risk. Like, you're not asking them to give you a blueprint to a nuclear bomb. You're asking them about something that will become ultimately public in a few years. It's just not yet. And so in that sense, many of these people are, it's not, they don't run the legal risk. And you also don't want them to ask them questions that does create a legal risk. Now, there are sometimes interviews where people do want to talk to you because they may realize that, for instance, this is an important issue for them. They feel that this is something that matters to them, but they may not feel comfortable either in their current job to talk about something, or they feel that the issue is still secret, it's classified for national security reasons, for instance. And one of the things that is done in such situations is that you may do the interview and then you seal it and you make an agreement with the person that it's going to be released either, I don't know, in 5 years when the documents will cease to be secret, or when this person leaves job, or sometimes the agreement is even to release them after the death of the person. I have heard of people who have interviewed, for instance, former diplomats who did want to share their life story and perceptions on really important momentous events, but they did not want to do it during their life because they were still afraid about the reactions from others. So they would do like hours and hours and hours of interviews with people, but they would agree that these will be released only after their death. And so there are these workarounds, or people who are still in active policy. So maybe they were involved in a certain momentous negotiation 30 years ago, and then they climbed the rank of their civil service, and now they may be a secretary or somewhere else. And they do realize that it's important to talk about something that happened 30 years ago, but not in their current job. And so again, you can agree that once they leave their current job, this transcript might get released to the public. About the question about people who are fundamentally unreliable, I think it really depends on whether you know in advance that this person is unreliable or whether it turns out to be unreliable. If it is someone whom you know already at the beginning that they are fundamentally unreliable, I would question the wisdom of talking to them in the first place. But if you go and talk to them I would say bring documents and sort of try to ground it as much as possible in these documents. And they may try to tell you that these documents are not true, and that's their good right, but it does provide some sort of anchoring. If during an interview you find out that someone is telling you a story that is completely in opposition to everything else that you have heard about a particular event before, you can raise it. I mean, this is the beauty of the method, that it gives the respondent flexibility, but it also gives you the possibility to. So you can say things like, "Oh, this is really interesting to say. My other interviewees would tell me something else. Do you care? Can you explain, or do you know where this discrepancy can come from?" And they sometimes, again, this is something that they may say, well, I don't know where that other view comes from, but they may sometimes sort of try to, you may try to understand where they are coming from. My own experience is that people who want to blatantly lie are unlikely to accept your invitation. So the people who are going to accept your invitation are more likely to be the ones who actually want to share something.
So much. We've got a couple of minutes left. There's one hand up left and a couple of questions in the chat. Let's take the hand and see whether we can come to the ones in the chat. Over to you, Isa.
Hi, thank you so much for taking the time for this presentation. I'm curious if you've had to navigate situations where there's a language barrier, and sort of any tips you might have for that. So maybe the interview is being conducted in English, you hope to publish in English, but maybe a handful of interviewees are either English is not their primary language or a language they feel super comfortable speaking in. How you make sure, I guess, you get the full message that they're trying to share in the interview.
Fantastic question. So I was lucky enough to do mostly interviews with people who either felt comfortable in English because they were diplomats or professionals in this field and they spoke English all their life, or with people with whom I could find a language that they felt comfortable with. The key goal is to speak to the person in a language that they are comfortable in. So because you want it's not, this is going to sound really, really bad, but it's not about you being okay with the language. It's about them being okay in the language that you talk to them. And so if that requires you to, if they want to talk in Klingon, you're going to bring a translator from Klingon to English. And you do the interview in Klingon, and then you may publish, for instance, the transcript between the Klingon and English. You're going to publish the bilingual one. What I have done in the past, I have done an interview with a respondent in Japan who was in a very senior position in a very prominent organization. And he wanted to be interviewed in Japanese, a language which I unfortunately don't speak. And so his organization supplied a translator, someone who has been working with this person for 20 years. And so this translator essentially translated my questions to Japanese and then translated the answers back to English. And we then published the version of the interview in English. And we made it clear at the beginning of the transcript that there was a translator involved, and this translator was someone who was supplied by the organization. I have also done interviews with respondents, for instance, in Dutch. Dutch is not my native language. It's actually my language number 4, so I do language errors when I speak in Dutch. But it's a language in which my respondents feel the most comfortable in. And so I would do the interview in Dutch, and then I would likely polish my questions, but only for the grammar, so that it doesn't mess up people's understanding. And again, I would sort of make this clear in the transcript, saying that my questions were lightly polished for language, just so that there are no errors, no language errors there.
so much. We're nearly out of time. There's one question in the chat that a couple of people have said they're particularly interested in the answer in, so I will go slightly over just in the interest of getting your views on that. Do you recommend sending an interviewee the question in advance so they can prepare, or is it best to get their impressions in the moment?
My own approach is not to do that, because there are some interviewees who are going to think too much about what they want to answer to each particular question. Having said this, I saw that Francisca has put a question about what happens if people insist on seeing the questions. I would send around the areas that I'm interested in. So I wouldn't send directly formulated questions, but I would say I'm interested in knowing A, B, C, D, E, F. I would want, and I would provide sufficient detail for them to know what I want to talk about, so they're not caught off the guard, but I would not provide individual questions. If you are going to do a critical oral history, so you're going to bring documents, then it's perfectly acceptable to send these documents in advance to people. So essentially tell them, I want to discuss around these three documents, here they are. One thing that there is quite a strong consensus against doing, if you're ever going to do a critical oral history conference, or if you're going to do an oral history conference, it's advisable to do pre-interviews with people before, but it is very strongly advised not to share these interviews with each other. So if you're going to do an oral history conference, you want to bring people together, you want to talk before the conference one-on-one with each of them, but don't share these interviews with one another.
Thank you so much for that and for all of your insights. It's been absolutely fascinating. And thank you to everybody for brilliant questions. It's been a really great discussion. As always, the recording of this masterclass will be posted online after some light edits. And so do look out for that. We'll circulate that within the EVN and also to the participants. So yeah, thank you once again, Mikhail, and for your time, and thank you everybody, and we hope to see you again. Take care and have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you all for having me. Bye-bye.